Greetings, everyone. This is Ehav Ever from the Chronicles of Ehav Ever, and today I'm going to be doing another reaction video to a missionary video. This one in particular is a debate that is taking place between a messianic slash basically a missionary style person who says that they're a messianic rabbi. And he's basically in a debate with someone who's actually an Orthodox Jew. And the thing that I want to focus in on is not really the whole debate because, I think in one way or the other, this whole kind of the topic that they're talking about has been kind of discussed, but there's something that the actual missionary slash messianic person like actually says that's actually an incorrect statement that I want to address in this video. So now what I want to do is actually go to the part of the video that I'm going to be reacting to and actually let it play and then see talk basically get into what he talks about that I'm going to be basically going against here.
Yes.
Do you believe the sages teach the truth of the Hebrew Bible so that you can see the Messiah clearly?
Yes.
Okay. Exodus 23:2 states, "You shall not follow the masses in doing evil, nor shall you testify in a dispute so as to turn aside after a multitude in order to pervert justice." What does this mean? In 10 seconds, what does this mean?
Okay, so what I want to comment on it is this person here, Radar Apologetics, I guess is their name, is the missionary slash messianic in question. And he brings up this topic that is really wasn't, from what I understand, is not really a part of the original debate. But I guess it's to try to make a certain type of point. And I've seen messianics kind of go this route of trying to make a certain point that has nothing to do with the real point that they're being talked about. But just to kind of get it at another angle. So it's important to know that this is the person that is making this comment and to actually notice the statement that he actually makes here.
It means don't follow the majority to do evil.
Who is Rambam?
Rambam was a rabbinic scholar who compiled books such as the Mishnah Torah.
Okay.
He was
Do you know that? Do you know when Rambam reads Exodus 23:2, he says to follow the majority and literally changes the words of Exodus 23:2?
Okay, now this is what I wanted to comment on because this right here that he states is actually incorrect. And it's incorrect for a number of reasons, including, if you go to, what the Rambam actually wrote. And this is what I find important to, when someone brings something like this up, to actually make them say, basically say to them, okay, show me where he says that, show me what it is you're talking about. Actually, show me the text itself. Because what I'm about to do is actually go through the text and show you both what the Torah states as well as what the Rambam states, and actually, where the sources the Rambam gets from, and and you'll find that it's in contradiction to what this Radar Apologetics actually mentions. So let's actually do that now. Let's actually go to the part of looking at exactly what does the Torah state, and then looking at exactly what does the Rambam state about that, and where his sources are for that. Okay, so let's start with what does the Torah actually state. Okay, so the actual part he's talking about in Sefer Shemot, 2, which is 23:2, it makes the following statement: Lo thiye acharei rabim lo ra'oth, v'lo ta'aneh al riv, lintoth acharei rabim lahatoth. So there's something very important that one has to notice here. Now, in most texts that people read from modernly, in terms of Hebrew, there's what's called you notice these little markings under the actual words and sometimes above. Some of these are actually like this here is a vowel. So in ancient Hebrew, they were I think prior to about 1,500 years ago, there were no actual written markings for vowels. Everything was like written consonantally, meaning that you would have to like already know orally, meaning an oral tradition, an oral Torah, if you will, would have to have already been passed down to you to actually understand how to pronounce words. And I've talked about this in other videos. Now, some of the markings you see here, like here, and also here, are what's called ta'amim. Ta'amim are almost like punctuation. And also, this system of punctuation is about 1,500 years old also. It's also something in ancient times that wasn't there. So what this means, and including this, so what this means is that, for example, when one reads this text, one would have to in order to read correctly, would have to know what the ta'amim are. And why is that important? Because in order to say, for example, this section here, which says "Lo tiye achorei rabim la ra'oth," which is like you will not be after many, rabim means like many, la ra'oth. to basically make something that's bad. And it's not 100% evil. Ra'ut in this situation, in this scenario, is not really translated as evil. It's in order something that's not good or not good, not the best. You could also say evil, but it's not evil specifically in this particular circumstance, and we'll see why that is. So this ta'am here is called atonoho, which is almost like a semicolon in English. And again, without this system, because someone could complain, especially a messianic and especially a person like this, could actually say, oh, well, all that's made up by the rabbis. The rabbis made this stuff up. Well, one of the problems with saying that is you could easily say that there's no situation where you would know when this sentence starts and finishes. So, for example, he took this whole statement as one sentence. The only reason he could ever know that is because the English translation he's reading from has provided him with the commas and also the semicolons and also the periods. Like this here is sof pasuk. Sof pasuk in English would be like a period, meaning the end of a sentence. But in an actual Torah scroll, none of these markings would be here. So you would have to already know, like based on an oral tradition, where the sentence starts and where it ends. So that's the first part. So the reason why this is important is because if we read further, down the line, like we said earlier, what we'll notice here is the Talmim tell us that there's three elements to this particular statement, and they're broken down in this way. Statement number one is Lo tiye aharei rabim lo. How do we know that? Because of atonoho here. And again, if someone wants to say, I don't agree with any of that, you would have no way of knowing where this sentence starts and ends. You could say it ends right here, Lo tiye. And then you could say the next sentence, aharei rabim. And you could say there's another sentence, le ra'ot. But again, according to the text itself and according to the oral tradition that's been passed down, which there is no other tradition about how to read ancient Hebrew, except for what existed in the Torah-based Jewish community, or someone wants to say the rabbinical Jewish community. There's no other system out there. Even the Karaites, for example, hold by this system, and they don't hold by the oral. They claim they don't hold by oral Torah, but they actually have their own form of it, but they just don't go by the Talmud. So this is the first statement, that you will not go after the majority in a situation where there's something ra, not good. So this is the actual way that you would actually understand that, and we'll see why in the next bit. So the next part of the statement of this particular pasuk or this sentence would be "V'lo ta'aneh al riv." So, and to like not respond like to, something that is there's one way of looking at it is like Reeve could be like an argument. But there's also another way that's looked at in terms of how this is understood. And you have to remember that a lot of this comes from the fact that the Torah is the foundation of how a Torah-based lifestyle is lived, including the judicial system. And we'll see in just a second why that statement I'm making is important. And then the last element is lintot aharei rabin lahatot. Now, again, let's go by and see how do I understand that this is broken up in three parts. One, because of the da'am here, which is almost like a semicolon in English, which is like a stop and thought. The next one is zirgo here, okay? And then the next one is sof pasuk here. So the understanding of pretty much every Torah-based Jewish community that is ancient is that when you read the Torah, there's several different elements that you can pull out of it. One is like strictly speaking what is written there, and another one is that there's other connections you find to the text in different places, as well as that there's like meanings that would have to be passed down and orally transmitted. So let's do something here. Now that we've analyzed what the actual Hebrew text of the Torah actually says, because the last part here is lintot aharei rabim lahadot. So essentially, this is the statement that's understood when, in Jewish circles, when we say we go by the majority. Well, the question could be, well, what do you mean by you go by the majority? And it's based on this statement here, "Lentot aharei rabim lahadot." So this is the statement that the Rambam focuses on, that which is, this Radar Apologetics is mentioning. But what we'll see soon is that he actually probably did not even read the Rambam, or he just simply heard what he got. The statement he made, probably heard it from someone, but he's probably never really sat down and studied the Rambam, especially not in Hebrew. So here's why. Okay, so if we look at the Mishnah Torah, with the breakdown the Rambam gives in the beginning and the introduction to the book, where he actually breaks down all of the 613 mitzvot, which is directly derived from a book that he wrote earlier called the Sefer HaMitzvot. So when we get to mitzvah kuf ein he, which would be basically 175, what we find is the following. He says, "Lintot aharei rabim im tiye machlochet ben hasanhedrin bedinin sheneamar aharei rabim lahatot." And he quotes from Shemot Kaf Gimel Bet. So that's Exodus 23:2. So this is, I think, what the Radar Apologetics guy is trying to talk about. Now, again, I get the impression that he didn't read this in Hebrew, or he only maybe heard this from someone. And here's why: because even in what the Rambam wrote, there's several components here. The first one, and this is important point number one, he writes here, "Lintoth achari rabim im tiye machlokat." So you, as someone who's watching this as an English speaker, someone who listened to that previous video may say, okay, well, what does that even mean, Ehav? You're just simply reading off Hebrew words. What does it mean? Translated, what this means is the Rambam explains that we go by the majority if there's a machloket, that a machloket is a disagreement. What the Rambam is talking about here is, which is in the next particular important statement, number 2, is ben hasanhedrin bedinin. What does this mean? This is basically meaning that this is in when it comes to judgments made by the Supreme Court of the Torah-based nation, the Sanhedrin, the Mosaic court. So when there's a Mosaic court, in the land of Israel that holds by Torah, and there is a disagreement about a judgment, we go by the majority. And it's based upon this statement that was made earlier, Achari Rabim Lahatot. So this is the baseline of what Rambam's talking about in this particular area. And this is, I think, what this particular missionary is actually criticizing. But here's where this is why I say I don't believe he actually read the Mishnah Torah. So let's look at what the Rambam also mentions. Okay, so again, this is a mitzvah aseh. Mitzvot aseh means this is a positive mitzvah, something that we are required to do, for example. Now, the next particular type of mitzvah is what's called mitzvot lo aseh, something that we're not supposed to do. So it's like on one side we have, these are the mitzvot, you are supposed to do them. And on the other side of the negative mitzvot lo ta'aseh, these are what we're not supposed to do. So he says here, the Rambam, the Rambam in the Mishnah Torah states the following. When it comes to mitzvah, in particular, he says, shelo lintot acharei rabim b'dinei nafashot. Im hayu mehayavim yoter al hamazagin ahod, sheneamor, lo tiye acharei rabim laraot. Shemot kaf gimel bet. So translating what this means is that Rambam says here, in the mitzvah lo taseh, the negative mitzvah, what we're not supposed to do, he says we're not supposed to go after the majority when it comes to judgments concerning the execution or death penalty. So what the understanding here is very clear. And when he goes on here, for example, the next line, it says, if there's a situation where the person is basically found to be considered to be guilty from one side, as well as from one side, and then the other side someone says he's considered to be not guilty in this situation, we're not supposed to go after something, the majority, and to do something that's that has a bad consequence. And that's what it means by lara'ot here. It isn't for example, there is one aspect of this that the rabbis understand, that if there's a situation where you're off on your own, for example, and there's a majority of people doing bad things, of course we're not supposed to follow them. We don't need this mitzvah to do that, because there's other mitzvot that tell us not to do that already. But this mitzvah is dealing with, because it's in the fact that's in the part of the Torah called the Parasha Mishpatim, this deals with legal, authorities, in legal situations. So there's no situation where you're going to have a Sanhedrin that everybody's evil, and that's what this part of the Torah doesn't even say. Don't follow the evil majority. It just simply says, lo tiye acharei rabim laraot. So let's say that the majority says, okay, this person, has been found guilty, something that, is capital punishment. That's the first, important element of this. Shelo lintot acharei rabim b'dinei nafashot. The Rambam says the exact same thing the Torah says here, to not go after the majority, but the qualifier is b'dinei nafashot. So meaning that if there's a situation where you have a death penalty and the majority is saying that this person is guilty, but for example, if you say that, okay, wait a minute, I have questions about that, I'm not sure about that, and the majority is saying guilty, we don't just go by the majority because of the majority saying guilty. The rabbi who and this is dealing with judges, the judge who's involved in this situation has to stand up and go against the majority, meaning that even if the majority says that this is the the judgment that should be, they're still going through the process of making judgment. The person has to be able to stand up and say, okay, I don't agree with that, and here's my reasoning why. And that's an important point, that we're never supposed to just simply say, okay, well, everybody else is voting this way, I'll just go with them. This is what this particular pasuk is talking about. And this is what the Rambam is talking about also. The other important point is, again, he uses this statement based upon what we saw earlier of Shemot Kaf Gimel Bet, Exodus 23:2. The same thing that this particular missionary is claiming, that the Rambam says you go by the majority. The Rambam says in this situation you don't. So the issue is very simple. Normally, you can tell when someone has like a non-Torah based background. When for them, a lot of the lines of the Torah are just simply black and white, this, that, whatever. But with within the Jewish community, there's nuance to it because if you're a judge in a judgment situation, it isn't just simply black and white. It isn't like don't go after the majority. Done. But what if the majority's right? What if the majority's doing the right thing? For example, this pasuk from the Torah says, "Lo tiyeh acharei rabim la'ra'ot." Which means, let's take this translation, for example, and say that, okay, it says don't go after the majority to do evil. Okay, well, what if the majority is doing good? Can we go after the majority then? Well, obviously, yes. If the majority is doing the right thing, then you go after the majority. But if the majority has, let's say in two scenarios, one, the scenario is the majority is doing the wrong thing. Of course, you can't follow them. There's other mitzvot that talk about that. But if you're in a judicial situation and the majority is saying that this is the punishment, there's a punishment that comes along with the situation, then there's a situation where, the Torah tells us, okay, if you are questioning that, or if there's something that doesn't seem right, don't go after the majority. And in fact, later on, we'll see in a bit, the Rambam even mentions that, let's say, for example, you're a judge, and, just so someone knows before we get to this point, in the judicial setting of, the Torah, there always has to be an odd number of judges, meaning that, for example, a regular town or a city can have a judge, what's called a bet din, and a bet din is made up of three judges. There has to be three. It can't be four and it can't be two. Because what happens if like you have an even number and the judgment is split evenly, meaning that one group says, okay, this person is guilty, and the other group says this person is innocent, and nobody can convince anyone. Then if you don't have an odd number, you have no way to really deal with the fact that there's, it's split evenly. But if you have a three judge, situation, you have a situation where one person may say guilty, another person may say innocent, and then the third judge has to like figure out based on his Torah background what exactly is the side I should be on. And that judge cannot say, because the one saying guilty is a greater rabbi than all of us, and he knows better than I do, and I have questions, he can't say, well, I'll just go by what that rabbi says, because that's one of the other understandings that is derived from this pasuk, meaning that within the Jewish community, the Torah-based Jewish community, every line of the Torah has layers of what can be derived from it, and not just like one simple thing. The issue is that the Creator of all things gave the Torah as a multi-layered thing, and not just one thing. So, if we go a little bit further with this, and we've already debunked what this guy was saying to begin with, where he's like saying the Rambam said one thing, the Rambam is, actually provided more than one thing that he's saying. Let's actually look at, for example, I'm going to actually close this part down. And let's actually go into looking at the actual text itself of, a little bit detailed, because the part I just presented is only a fraction of what the Rambam was talking about. It's like the introduction to the Mishnah Torah. So let's go and look at the Mishnah Torah itself and the internal parts where he gives in more detail exactly what he means, by some of these issues we're talking about. So if we go to the part of the Mishnah Torah that is the Sefer Shoftim, and when especially the part that deals with the Sanhedrin, how the judicial system of a Torah-based nation is supposed to operate. So what I'm going to do now is do a search on this particular part of the Torah. We're asking a question about Shemot. Then it's going to be Kaf Gimel Bet. Okay, so if we look at our reading here, we see that shows up 5 times in the Mishnah Torah in this particular part of what's called Hilchot Sanhedrin, meaning that this is like the mitzvot that deal with the judicial system in a Torah-based nation. So I'm going to make this a little bit bigger. And I, of course, have to search it again because it just disappeared. Okay, so let's look at this first part here. And it says here the following. This is in the Mishnah Torah, Hilchot Sanhedrin, chapter 5, section 5, or people use the word verse 5. And it says, Ummanin she'en danim dine nafashot ela be'asrim u'shlosha af al pi shedivrei gabalo han hare hu omer v'shofatu hu'aydo v'hitzilu hu'aydo. So, and this is from Bimidbar Lamed He Kaf Dalet Kaf He. So to start off with, the Rambam mentions a situation where, for example, there's a particular type of court where you're supposed to have 23 judges that are involved in this court. And he's basically giving the baseline of how exactly this is supposed to operate. That, this court system works upon evidence, and also in terms of, having, judges that, can basically deal with, this judicial system in an odd number way, even if it's something that's been received, for example, that anytime you have a situation where you have to like judge on something, there should be a number of judges involved, and it has to be an odd number. So one of the things he mentions here is concerning this point that we've been talking about, that if you have this situation where you have, let's say, a group of judges who there's a basic disagreement, basically, disagreement of, what the judgment is. He says here, for example, you can't have less than like this number, you have to have a certain number and it has to be an odd number. So basically here, what he mentions that, adding like three judges to the, situation where, you have like, let's say like 20 judges, or, basically you have 10 judges where you have to add more, and it have to be enough to have an even odd number, sorry. And the reason is, he says, Kadesh yeh beth din shakul, v'yeh bo acharei rabim lahatot. So basically, this is that. Remember, we said that there was three elements to that pasuk in the Torah, which is like from Exodus 23:2. So he's mentioning this one element of, going after the majority, because again, think of it this way: you have a judicial system, and then someone says, okay, well, the minority says that this person is innocent. Everybody on this, like, judicial panel of 23 keeps the Torah, and everybody, is, righteous, if you will, using an English term. But, the judgment in this situation is split, where we like, let's say if you only have 20, then we have a situation where, okay, well, maybe 10 go one way and 10 go the other way. And it's like, well, okay, how can you decide what to do if everybody is like split down the middle? Well, you need to bring in an odd number. And once the number goes towards the majority, we're required to go by the majority in that situation, because again, we're not talking about people who are evil, which the Torah never mentions in this particular part of the Torah. It doesn't say that the Rabbim, the majority are evil. It just says like what is going to happen is not good, and it's bad, and of course execution is bad. Even if the person is required to be executed, according to the Jewish perspective on the Torah, it's not a good thing that that's happening, so it's very rare. Historically, throughout the Torah-based situation, when there was a Torah-based nation in the land of Israel, that executions had to happen from the Sanhedrin. It was very rare, and it's considered to be that if, well, let's say within like 70 years, like, a person was executed, that was considered to be like a bloodthirsty, court. Because it's considered to be that shouldn't be the standard. The standard should be that we can help people try to make, do better. We should try to help people, do the right thing, and try to help them like make what's called tshuva, or like, to the Torah, rather than having to execute them. But it would take a lot for a person to have to be executed. And if that had to happen, society failed in some way. And that's the idea here. So if you have a situation where it's split down the middle, you can't say, okay, well, we'll just, not decide on anything. Well, you have to go by the majority at some point. And even modern day courts go by that. If you go to the American judicial system, they also go by the majority. And I think if some cases where you have to like convince, well, if you have like a jury trial, for example, you have to convince the whole jury. So that is the idea that, and they actually got that idea partially from what I understand from the Rambam. That's why his face is like actually like, held up in certain judicial systems in America. So let's go and look at another scenario that is mentioned here, and see what the next one is mentioned. Okay, so here, if we go to Hilchot Sanhedrin Perek Het, which would be like chapter 8, it says, Bet din shenach lagu mikatzothon omorim zakai umiksothon omorim hayov holachim achar harov. וזו מצוות עשה של התורה, שנאמר אחרי רבים להדות. So again, he mentions here this idea that if you have a bet din and, there's a disagreement, about what the judgment is. Some of them say that, basically the person is not guilty, or the situation is, because it doesn't have to be like guilt in terms of execution. It could even be in terms of a court where, for example, like let's say it's just a regular, like let's say a property dispute, and the judicial system is, basically an odd number, group of judges. Well, we go by the majority, and that's what, that's derived from acharei rabim lahadot. Because again, if you look at the Torah and go by the ta'amim, this is where this understanding comes from, because the ta'amim break up the statements in the Torah. It's not all one sentence, for example, in the way that most English speakers would look at the English text and say it, but the Hebrew text is not the English text. So let's look at another place where this shows up. Okay, so if we look at chapter 8, section 3 of the Mishnah Torah, Hilchot Sanhedrin, says, Mipi Hashmuah lamadu, she'al hazeh hizhir b'Torah, v'amar, lo tiyeh acharei rabim lara'ot. So he says, according to like basically when he says Mipi Hashmuah, that means that from Hashem. So that's something that we learn from Hashem, from Moshe Rabbeinu. So Hashem taught us basically that to warn us in the Torah Lo yitiye acharei rabim laraot, to like not go after the majority to do something that has a bad consequence or something that's bad, again using his terminology evil, but it doesn't mean evil in all situations. The ra'ot doesn't fully mean like evil, just like has it's a bad consequence. So the Rambam even states this also. So this contradicts what he's talking about. And this is why I say I don't get the impression that he actually learned from read the Mishnah Torah himself. So let's go and see what the Rambam says about this particular incident. This situation says, Kalomar, im hayu harov noda'in l'ra'ah. So if the majority are like leaning towards like the bad consequence, let's say, for example, he says, laharog, lo thiye acharehem. So like if they're saying like basically this person has to be executed, don't go after them. Ad, until שיטו הטעויות הגדולות ויוספו ומחייבים שניים. So essentially it's like saying, okay, if you have like let's say a three judge court, and the situation comes up where it's like, okay, you know, the one side is, basically saying, okay, looks like this person is guilty. This person is guilty and the punishment should be execution. We don't just simply say because, well, okay, well, makes sense. Let's go by him. Everybody just make the judgment based on him. And basically what he's saying is you can't go by that until you have two people who, two judges who agree with that. Because again, this is all judicial, that what the Rambam's dealing with here. It says, then he says, and again, that's, where the last part of that pasuk where it says like, after the majority, lintot achore, the rabim lahatot, lintot achore rabim lahatot. So he says, well, hatofoch latovo, al pi achad, ra'ah al pi shnaim. So he says, okay, when it comes to like going by the majority, especially when it's like something like positive, if it's a good thing that we're saying, like let's say the outcome's a good outcome in the judgment, we can even go by one. Just by one to make, have a good outcome. But if it's something that's going to have a negative outcome or a bad outcome, we go by the majority, like al pi shnayim. V'chol elu hadavrim kabbalah. So this is Kabbalah. This is something that, we were taught how to understand the Torah from Hashem, that, was basically taught to Moshe Rabbeinu and taught to all of his students, so on and so on. So what this means is the following. Let's say that you have a judicial situation where, let's say that someone, has like money that, is like basically taken from them, stolen from them, or extorted from them, something like that. And the positive, like judgment is that this person get their money back. We can even go by, al pi achad, like per one. But if it's something that, has a bad outcome, for example, let's say, like we said, execution, you need the majority to go by that, because we don't just simply say by one, okay, well, we'll go by this one guy. And that's that's all we need to be able to execute someone. No, we don't do that. And that's one of the differences you have where if you have a system where you only have one judge who decides on everything, that's not in a really balanced situation. You need to have other options. You also need to have dissenting voices. That's one of the understandings that the rabbis get from this particular line of the Torah, that you have to have dissenting voices. So let's go even further. There's like about two more places we can look at that the Rambam mentions this here. And he says in chapter 10, section 1, Echad min hadayanim b'dinei nefashot shehaya min hamazakin או מן המחויבים, לא מפני שאמר דבר שנראה לא בדעתו, אלא נוטו אחרי דברי חברו, הרי זה עובר בלא תעשה, ועל זה נאמר לא תענה על ריב לנטות. So what the Rambam does here is he says, okay, let's say you have a situation where the judicial judgment is something when it calls the dinei nafashot, meaning like almost like execution. So you basically have a situation where, someone says, okay, well, look, we have one side that's saying, the person is innocent. Another side says, that the person is guilty, and, of course, we know the punishment of going guilty is going to be a not a good thing. Even if the person is guilty, it's not a good thing. So lo mipnei she'amar davar hanir'eh lo v'dato. So let's say you're a judge and you're kind of questioning this whole situation. You're kind of like between the two. You're saying, okay, wait a minute, maybe it's this way, maybe it's that way. But you're still not fixed in terms of the judgment you're supposed to make as a trained Torah-based judge, because that's what all this is. The Rambam's talking about. It says, and that basically, it's almost like this decision. Okay, well, maybe I'll go by what my fellow colleague, my fellow judge who is saying guilty. Maybe I'll go by that, because and he talks about this a little bit later. He knows more than me. He's a bigger named rabbi than me. And the Rambam says, no, you can't do that. That's because the Torah tells us here, lo te'aneh al riv lentot. So essentially he's saying that, if a judge went that way and decided, okay, I'm going to just go for the negative outcome because of the fact that this other judge who's with me is going for the negative outcome, just because of that, and I'm still not clear on, like, what exactly the situation is. He says that you've, like, done an avera, you've gone against the Torah and you've done a lo ta'aseh. So remember we talk about the negative mitzvot, the one we're not supposed to do. That's where what the Rambam wrote there kicks in, because this judge has now gone against what the Torah says by going, in a circumstance according to where his friend is going, and that's also learned from Exodus 23:2. Says Mepi Ashmua Amru Shelo Tomar B'Sha'at Minyan Dai She'eye Ke'ish Poloni Ele Omer Ma Shebofonecha. So essentially, that's where he kind of goes by this whole thing that, we learn this from Hashem, essentially, that when you have these issues of judgment, you have to be able to say that I'm going with a clear mind in this direction. And, on one end, for example, we go by the majority when it comes to the final judgment in the issue. But at the same time, if a person is a judge, and even if the majority are saying this and the person saying, well, I'm not fully closed on that issue, I have some issues with that, they have to stand up and say something. Even if the judgment is in favor of the negative outcome, they have to say something either way. Because that's the thing, when you make judgments, you have to make a judgment. But at the same time, if it's not, a judgment that's felt as right, the person has to say something and they have to stand up for it. So let's go to the last part here. Okay, so what he says here, this is in chapter 10, second part of 2. ובכללו זה שלא יחזור המלמד זכות בדיני נפשות ללמד חובה, שנאמר לא תענה על ריב לנטות. This is again, he's quoting Exodus 23:2 concerning the issue of, for example, if you are dealing with the issues of, like execution, bidene nafashot, concerning whether the person's liable, whether they're not liable. And he says, "B'meh davorim amorim b'sha'at masau matan aval b'sha'at gamar din yesh lelamed zechut lachzor ulahimanoth im hamachayavin." So one of the things that is brought down in halakha, that if, these questionable issues come up, that, there is a requirement to have to go back sometimes and go back over the judgment, because again, the desire should not be to execute someone. And that's where I say that this person doesn't seem to have really studied the Rambam, because they just kind of mention this one thing. And I get the impression that it's just kind of like this kind of debate tactic where you just throw something out there that has nothing to do with the topic in order to try to make this point, and especially to a point to people who don't actually, or, probably not even Jewish, probably have never studied any of this stuff and have no idea who the Rambam even is. But just by throwing that name out there and saying, well, the Rambam, and the rabbis teach the opposite of the Torah. That's where I think that the goal of this particular missionary is to try to make this claim that the rabbis and the Rambam are teaching the opposite of what the Torah states. And that's where I say that this person is not being honest in that area by making this claim and by not even showing the source of the claim. So another aspect that a person that can be looked at with this is if we go to the Sefer HaMitzvot. And this is, if I remember correctly, the Sefer Mitzvot, the Rambam wrote before he wrote the Mishnah Torah. And essentially, it's where he kind of just goes through the 613 mitzvot and kind of lists what they are and gives some basic details about them. So what we want to do is we want to use what we learned from the Mishnah Torah. And because this predates the Mishnah Torah and also is a little bit more focused specifically on the mitzvot in certain areas, we want to look at the two places where the Rambam talks about this particular part of the Torah, both in the positive mitzvot, which we're going to look at now, and the negative mitzvot we're going to look at in just a second. So let's look at the positive mitzvot. So that would have been Kuf Ayin Hey. So Kuf Ayin Hey would be right about right here. Okay, so this is the mitzvah that he does. And what he basically does is he lists, okay, this is the mitzvah, and just gives some basic details about it. So he says, he שציוו לנטות אחרי רבים, כשתיפול מחלוקת בין החכמים בדיני התורה כולם, וכן נמשך בנטה בדין פרטי בין ראובן ושמעון דרך משל, כשתפול מחלוקת בין דיני עירם, im Shimon hu chayav, im Reuven. So what he's talking about here is the issue of this positive mitzvah that he mentioned earlier about going after the majority when it comes to there being a disagreement. A machloket. Machloket is like a disagreement or an argument between the chachamim, people who know Torah, Bedin Bedine Torah. So if they're dealing with just like the regular issues of the Torah, like different judgments of the Torah, because the Torah tells us to have judges and to put them in place. So, it's one of the parashiot of the Torah is Shoftim. Sefer Shoftim, it says Shoftim v'Shotrim titen lacha. So we're supposed to give ourselves judges, and basically these judges have to deal with like judgments in different scenarios. So he mentions here that, for example, if we're dealing with just general issues, for example, let's say between Reuven and Shimon, and there's like something that's gone to court in their city, that we just simply have to decide. We go by the majority, which if you think about it makes sense, because again, we learn from this particular pasuk is as much as someone who doesn't know Hebrew may say, well, you're really stretching this out. Again, if you don't know Hebrew, how would you even know? Without the understanding of the Hebrew language and what's been passed down about it, nobody in English would know because the English text is not the text. The source text is the Hebrew text. So he talks about it in this circumstance. We go to the majority, because there's a requirement to make judgment, and there's a requirement to have an odd amount of judges, and there should always be a situation where there can be dissent, but we go by the majority in a circumstance like this, for example. So then, if we want to look at the negative aspects of the negative mitzvot, meaning the mitzvot, and I actually lost my place, the mitzvot that deal with what things we're not supposed to do, and go back over what the Rambam mentioned. And let me just find out exactly which ones that was. That was Resh Pei Bet. Okay, so we look for Resh Pei Bet. Okay, let's see here, Resh Pei Bet. Okay, so the Rambam, when dealing with in the Sefer Mitzvot, says the following: He's here shofet shelo lentot acharei rabim, kashe tiyeh hatosefet ish echad levad. So he says that there's circumstances where we don't go by the majority, and it's based on this particular line of the Torah, shelo lentot acharei rabim. So again, he's talking about judgments, dealing with judges. So for example, if there's a need, we add another judge. For example, that there's a need for there to be an additional judge here in this situation, and then he says, "V'or zeh ki kashetiyem machloket ben adayanim v'chote v'omru katzatam shehu chayav mita v'katzatam shehu patur v'hayu u'machayivim yoter mazakim v'minyan ish achad hine in eno mutar lahamit hachotehohu." So essentially, again, this is where he's talking about you can't go by, if there's a situation where we're dealing with the death penalty for someone who's like did, things against the Torah, and there's a, split in the judgment, we don't go by just one person and say, okay, well, the person says he's like guilty, another person says not guilty, or not even not guilty, but not, the punishment shouldn't be the death penalty. One person says the punishment should be this, the other person says the punishment should not be this. We don't just go by one guy and say, okay, let's go by this one guy. That's it. You have to add another judge, to be able to say that that's the ruling. But a person can't say just because this other judge is going that way, I'm going to go with him. You don't go after the majority. If two judges have said, okay, look, we understand the circumstances and we've made the ruling that this person must be executed, but the 1/3 judge is like, no, I don't agree with that. He has to make a disagreement. He has to put it out there. It can't just not be said because it's like, oh, they've already ruled. The two of them, they're going to win this anyway. I just won't say anything. No, you're required to say something, and there has to be a challenge put in place. And he says further, well, he's here ha'el et ha'dayan mehamit oto ad shiyu hamachayvim yoter min hamazakim shanaim. So of course, this is where he talks about, we have the majority has to make a ruling. You have to bring in, enough judges to, say that in this circumstance you have two. So one of the things that's actually brought up also by different rabbis in this area is not just that the fact that the word rabim or riv or rov that's used in it resh bet is used, but that it also means that, like, for example, if there's like one of the judges is of a greater magnitude, that's what I talked about earlier, then the other judges, he can't say, well, okay, well, this big name rabbi is going in the direction of something that's not positive. Meaning that the judgment is not positive for the person in question, even if the person is, guilty, but I still have questions about it. I can't just go with like the greater name rabbi, so if this rabbi's got 30 years of experience and I've only got 2, but I'm not clear on the situation, or there's something that I feel is really holding me back from going along, I can't just go along because he says so. I have to be able to, make my statement known, so that we can have, the right form of justice put in place. So, This is what, is very important. And this is why I say you have to go by the original text. And I think that's where the best place to kind of end this video. Um, this is the Torah. This is the way that the Torah looks. So the issue is very simple here, that we learn from the Torah different things from different layers of it, because again, the Jewish perspective is that, the Torah was given in different layers, that it isn't just like one simple thing in black and white that we get layers and layers of things to build a society based on the Torah. So again, the understanding of the Torah of this particular pasuk, this particular section of the Torah, is that it has three elements to it. Lo tihye acharei rabim l'ra'ot. If the outcome is a negative outcome, we can't simply go by the majority if there's a question, if there's a disagreement. We don't just simply go by who's the greatest of the rabbis, in this particular situation. And in the judges here, or what we're talking about here is going to be rabbis, because these are when people who are knowledgeable of the Torah. Or you can even say leaders of the community, because one of the things I think that people make mistakes with, especially when the Christian sphere with missionaries, is that they talk about the rabbis as if there's some separate set of humans outside of the Jewish people, when actually being a rabbi just means you're a leader within the Jewish community, someone who should know Torah and holds by Torah. And that doesn't mean, that every single person who has that title is, is under the right circumstance, which is true of anything. You can find that in any circumstance in life, where just because someone has a title or is a leader doesn't mean that they don't make mistakes. But that's the whole point of the judicial system, and that's why you have an odd number of people. But that again tells us here that there are three elements here. The next element is so that basically a person shouldn't be quick to make a judgment in some places. They should be able to say, okay, I've reviewed all the circumstances, and there's a disagreement, or where there's not an agreement on something, I have to be able to respond to that rationally, and I can't just jump to judgment. I can't go with like someone who's greater than me in terms of his knowledge, just because I have to be able to deal with the fact that I have some questions. I'm on this, I'm a judge just like everybody else is judges. I have some questions and I have some challenges to what's being presented here. And even if the majority says this, you still have to stand up and say something, irregardless. It's a requirement. And then the last part, lintot acharei rabim lahatot. At the end of the day, yeah, we do have to go to the majority, because we have to make a judgment. We don't go by the minority. So, if like, let's say, the majority is saying, this person's innocent. And then the minority says, no, this person's guilty, execute. Well, of course, we don't, go by the minority, because the minority is saying, execute. The majority is saying, don't execute. We can't just go by the minority in that situation. We would have to go by the majority. And at some point, we have to make a decision. So if a judicial panel of 23 are saying, 20 of them are saying, let's say, not guilty, and 3 are saying guilty. Well, do we like take this, part of the Torah and say, okay, well, we can't go after the majority, so we then have to go by the minority. Let's go execute. Does that make any sense? And that's where I say it's a layered thing when you deal with judgment, and that's what the Rambam's talking about. So this is my reaction to that. And again, I didn't really want to react to the whole video, because I think a lot of the debates sometimes that happen, especially with missionaries, are kind of silly in a sense. I mean, I think that's just my personal opinion, because I think that at the end of the day, when you pull up the Hebrew text, a lot of those debates, especially in English, fall apart, and you can easily end them within like 2 seconds or more, especially when you deal with historical issues. But I just wanted to talk about this one point, because I watched part of this debate and I saw this one thing he mentioned. I was like, hey, wait a minute, that's not true what he said. So again, this is Ehav from the Chronicles of Ehav, and I hope everything's well with you. Take care. Bye.